All right, hello everybody. This is Dr. Eric Balcavage, and today we are getting ready to do another episode of the Thyroid Answers podcast. This will be episode 10, and since we had such a great response to the episode we did on inability to lose fats and obesity with hypothyroidism, we figured we'd do another one and get a little bit more in depth. As usual, I'm joined by my partner in crime on the Thyroid Answers podcast, Dr. Erica Riggleman.
Hello.
Live from Winchester, Virginia, right?
Yes.
Yeah, snowy Winchester.
Yep.
So we're going to dig into this a little bit, but as you know, one of the biggest things that drives people into our offices when they've got health challenges is really, especially with thyroid issues, is their inability to lose weight. And, sounds vain, but really at the end of the day, we are concerned about our appearance and how we look and how we feel. And so I know in my practice, a male or female, they could have fatigue, their hair can be thinning, they could have dry skin, but really what they want to do is I want to lose weight,
yep.
Right?
And then they justify and say, if I could just lose the weight, I would then be happy, and then I would feel better because I would have less weight. And so they want to base it upon losing weight. And so it is a big driving factor that makes people realize they often judge health based upon size in this country. So people can still be sick and be thin, but when you're overweight, it's very visible to not only you, but to other people that you might be having some health challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when you look at people, it's not unusual for somebody to look at somebody who's thinner and say, well, look how healthy they are. But they don't know that person's got autoimmune disorders, that person's got Hashimoto's, or they're insulin resistant or diabetic or pre-diabetic or have just chronic inflammation. And the size does not always indicate state of health, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So what is if we have to talk about what's the big reason, 30,000-foot view of why people struggle to lose weight, what would you say is the main thing you could sum it up as?
Stress. And there's many different forms of it. That's definitely, that's an umbrella term, but when it all comes down to is that there's that cell danger response that we've talked to before, and there's some sort of stressor that's creating a heightened awareness in the body.
Yeah, and some people would say, well, I'm not stressed out. I think I'm calm, I'm relaxed, I'm not overly stressed, my life is pretty good. And we're not saying just emotional stress, although that plays a big role, and I know you want to talk about that. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about the chronic low-grade stressors that you may not even realize that are going on. Sometimes from a physical standpoint, too much activity, too little activity, right? Yeah. People that over-exercise and just think they're going to exercise their way to thinness. It doesn't always work, right? Because recovery is really important, and that can create a stress, just like lack of exercise or lack of activity can. Emotional stress is huge, and although a lot of people don't want to admit it, you know this really well because you practice something called QNRT in your office that really deals with the emotional side of stuff, and you see this quite a bit. I see it quite a bit. So why don't you talk a bit more about the emotional part, the emotional stressors, and maybe how you address it in your office.
Well, just like the other stressors, emotional stress can weigh down and put a burden on your body. And there was a study done, I think it was in the 2000s, called the ACE study. That was the Adverse Childhood Effect study that looked at adverse things that happen to children and then followed them through their years and then saw what it actually, what health challenges and they found that if a child had an adverse emotional thing that happened in their childhood, that later on in life, they were going to have more health challenges than somebody who didn't. And so they quantified a adverse emotional stressor as being, parents got a divorce, there was a death in the family, they maybe had a major move, they saw something that they shouldn't see, maybe they were physically abused, sexually abused, of that nature. And so that in itself, what happens is traumas happen to everybody. You're never going to live in a world where you're not going to have emotional stress. But sometimes those stressors get stuck inside the nervous system. And when it gets stuck in the nervous system, and it's like a tape recorder that keeps playing the same little tidbit over and over and over, and you get stuck in that little rut. And so then bad behaviors, bad thinking patterns, and that stuck in the nervous system emotionally that's happening can raise cortisol. And then that's the heart of all emotional stressors, is that it's going to negatively affect your adrenals, making you produce more cortisol because it is a stressor. Your body doesn't know the difference between a physical stress and a chemical stress or an emotional stress. So if something's stuck inside your nervous system, oftentimes that cortisol, no matter what you do, whether you're, balancing the hormones and you're changing your diet and you're watching your exercise, if that one little thing gets missed, that's emotional, and you may think that you've gotten over it. And oftentimes, you may have gone through, years of talk therapy, but talk therapy only accesses about 5% of the nervous system. So the other 95 you may not be tapping into, and you may not be able to unstick that emotional thing that's really stuck in the nervous system. And so quantum neural reset technique is a procedure that we do in our office to let the nervous system guide us to where emotional things are being stuck, and then we activate the nervous system to release it. And this is huge with patients who have had emotional things happen to them. And I mean, honestly, who hasn't had emotional things happen to them in their life? Who hasn't been broken up by a boyfriend, or had a grandparent die, or, struggled with something emotionally? But if it gets stuck, it really can weigh on you later in life, and it compounds over time because you find ways to compensate and to bury it deeper and deeper and deeper. And then it becomes Pandora's box that if you don't want to deal with it, you can do everything around that to make it balanced in the body. But if you don't actually deal with that emotional stressor, and so you don't actually have to do the quantum neural reset technique technically, but you have to look and evaluate your life and see what emotional things have happened in your life that you may need to still deal with, and realize that it's in the past, you can't deal with it, and you can't let it affect you anymore as you move forward.
So essentially people they get these things happen to them, they don't fully address them appropriately, mm-hmm. and they've got just this bad programming kind of repeating itself like Groundhog Day in the back of their brain, just creating chronic levels of stress. It's not even at a conscious level of thinking, it's at the subconscious level, but yet it's still driving a chronic stress response. That's essentially what you're saying? Absolutely,
yeah. And we both know that the nervous system controls all endocrine function. So if something's stuck in the nervous system at a brain level, a subconscious level, of course that's going to have a negative impact on all of your hormones as it trickles down through the endocrine system.
And there's a level, we talk about homeostasis, which is the balance in the body, right? Between mm-hmm. fight or flight and rest and digest, the sympathetic versus parasympathetic. And the body can manage a certain amount of stress. Mm-hmm. And so if there's always chronic stress going on in the background, your capacity becomes a bit less, right? Mm-hmm. There's less stress you can feel. I usually explain it to my patients like a cup. If you got all this emotional baggage that you haven't dealt with, and that's like your cup being always at least half full. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to put more water into the cup, you can only put a half cups more in there. Whereas if you really deal with some of that emotional baggage and you empty the cup out on a regular basis, you can get a lot more stress. You can handle a lot more on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. And if we think about that cup analogy, most of us have that little Dixie cup that sits in our bathroom, right? That we rinse our mouth out with or gargle with when we get done brushing our teeth. And that little paper cup, I mean, that could be there forever as long as you empty the water out of it. Mm-hmm. But if you don't empty the water out of it, you leave some in there, the cup on the outside will look fantastic, but it'll rot away underneath, and you find out that, hey, it's leaking. And that's kind of how we are. We have that chronic stress in our life that we never dump this emotional baggage and deal with it appropriately. Then it just wears us away. I think that's what you're kind of referring to. It can wear us down from the inside out. It puts us in this kind of chronic stress response that we don't even realize is going on because it's at this subconscious level. And if that's going on constantly, then we can very easily exceed metabolic capacity when we have these other stressors going on in our life. And once we get that chronic stress response, it exceeds our homeostasis, our capacity to manage it, then we get the triggering of inflammatory chemicals. And once that happens, all hell breaks loose.
Yep.
Between deep dysregulating thyroid hormones to damage to the thyroid gland to Hashimoto's and autoimmune issues. That's when real problems really start to kick in. So I'm glad you brought that emotional piece up. I definitely think that's huge for so many people. And a lot of people don't want to address it. They'll say, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing wrong. You know there is, you can see it on their face. We've all had stressors. And as you said there, you know, you can say, well, I'm just going to ignore it. Ignoring it doesn't really fix it. Just facing it, dealing with it. If you had it bad growing up, your dad beat you as a kid, then you just gotta forgive that process and move on. And that those types of things happen to everybody. If you're abused, it's a hard thing to get away from. But if you let that bag stay with you, then you give whoever did that to you ownership. Your life, and give them, they still have control. So somehow you've got to deal with that and get it behind you. So let's talk about the other stressors too, because I know there's two other stressors that we commonly talk about. And right before we started the podcast, you were talking about chemical stress and how that really can cause chronic problems with inability to lose weight.
Absolutely. And so we live in I guess you can call it a toxic world. And so we're being exposed to chemicals on a daily basis, whether we want to or not. So there's a lot of things that you don't have to physically put on your skin or put in, you know, in your mouth or in your body to be exposed to them. You know, it's in our air, it's in our environment. So there's a level of toxicity that you just can't get away from. We don't live in a bubble. And so they say that each year they're increasing 3 to 5% more environmental toxins. And so it's not getting any better. And so that environmental toxins, you know, they're big with their persistent organic chemicals in the body that they love to live in fat tissue because often the body doesn't know how to break them down. They're not water soluble toxins, which can be broken down easily. Most of these chemicals or toxins are fat soluble. So when they get into the body and the body doesn't know what to deal with, how to break them down or even eliminate them, or maybe your cup is already too full to deal with it, what it does is oftentimes it stores it away into fat tissue. And so there's that level of when you are trying to lose weight, if you do lose that first 5 pounds, you may be dumping a whole bunch of those chemicals out into the system. And if your body doesn't know how to handle that, you know, it's going to shut down everything because it sees that as a threat or a danger, and it doesn't want to create any more toxicity in the body. And so you got to understand that if you're losing toxins in one area of your body and you still don't know how to get it out of your body, you know, break it down, it's going to go somewhere else. So oftentimes you're just moving toxins from one area of your body to another, and your brain and your nerves are made of fat. And so that's another very common area that these toxins like to be stored at. So you're taking a place, you know, fat cells are a pretty safe place. They don't have a lot of function in the body. So hiding them in there is pretty safe, but you release those chemicals and they then get stored in your brain, then you're going to start to have some neurological decline. And so, you know, overall, there's two ways you can approach that. You have to get your body able to break some of these chemicals down and eliminate them. So reduce your overall load in your body. And then you also want to try to manage any sort of chemical exposure that you can. And so the big thing is going to be food. And so again, you're never going to be 100% chemical wise, but if you can make sure that the stuff that you are putting in your body is as best quality as you can, you know, that's going to go a long way.
Right. So chemical toxicity is huge, whether it's in the air, right? So if you're driving your car and you're in a car every day and you're driving in traffic every day, you're being exposed to chemical toxins there. Depending on the environment you live in or work in, we've got toxins from our carpet, from our paint, from potential mold toxicity if we live in an environment like that. If we work in a bigger building where there's exposure from different chemicals, in whether it's in the air conditioning ducts or things being pumped through, that can be toxicity. Water is a huge source of toxicity. So if you're drinking city water that's been cleaned, right? But that doesn't necessarily get all the chemicals out of it. The medications, the foods, the hormones that we find in water that's been treated, and what's in our faucets. Some people say, well, I'm not going to drink that water. I'm going to drink bottled water, but they're drinking plastic bottled water, which has got its own level of toxins in it. Maybe they're getting toxicity from they're storing their food in Tupperware and then microwaving that food in the Tupperware, and that's creating some issues. So there's just so many ways that the body can become toxic. And as you said, once we get this toxic load into the system, the body either has to detoxify it and use the detoxification pathways, which are very B vitamin dependent. And if the body's healthy enough to manage that, great, it'll detox that and get it out of the system. However, if there's problems with nutrient deficiencies because of poor diet, because of medicine depletion of nutrients, because of infections or malabsorption, then the body has to do something with it. And one of the best things it can do with that is store it in the fat tissue. And as you said, the fat can just kind of hang out there. You can store stuff there. The problem is the more fat cells more of these toxins we have, the more fat cells we need to actually store the stuff, right? And if we think of the fat as just this kind of blob of tissue, but really the fat tissue is an endocrine gland, right? It produces inflammatory chemicals, it produces pain chemicals, it drives insulin resistance, it creates a number of problems. And so it is one of those things. So if somebody's struggling to lose weight, you have to start to take a look at your food, your environmental toxins, what you're putting into the system. And as you said, if you try and do a detox, right? You try and rapid weight loss. I'm gonna go on a 500 or 600 calorie a day diet. Yeah, you may really dig into those fat cells, but you're gonna now dump those toxins into the system. And if the body's detoxification system is not able to manage it, it's gonna wreak havoc and create a lot of problems. So
yeah, not to mention that if you're on a low-calorie diet, you're losing weight, but you're also not probably getting your nutrients that you need to sustain to be able to detox from that. So you're kind of getting a catch-22 there where you're not getting the nutrients to be able to detox from the toxins that you're releasing because you're losing weight. And so you get a double whammy there, and you eventually the weight loss, it's going strong for a week or two, and then all of a sudden you hit a wall because your body goes, oh, we're not going to keep doing this anymore because it's going to create damage if we keep going down this path.
Right. And you know this, we've talked about this before. People who go on low-calorie diets, they can work at least the first time, maybe the second time they do it. But usually after that, they've really changed their metabolism set point. And so it really slows their metabolism down, because when you starve the body for extended periods of time, the body's metabolism it changes the whole set point of what your new normal is. And your body's going to say, listen, we're not going to burn a lot of fat because this person keeps starving me, and I need to make sure I've got reserves on board. And what most people lose is not fat. What they lose a lot of time on those starvation diets is muscle tissue. And so if you lose weight, but you don't necessarily lose the fat, what you've lost is muscle mass, and muscle mass is what burns calories. Fat doesn't burn a lot of calories. Matter of fact, I don't think it burns much of anything.
I don't think it does either. And that's where you get the skinny fat people, where they look skinny on the outside, but they have no muscle tissue whatsoever. They are just pure fat and they're exercising all the time usually, and they're like, I can't build any muscle. And there's just an underlying level where they don't have the proper hormones to be able to even make muscle. And oftentimes they go on these starvation diets where they have poor eating habits, where when they think they're burning fat when exercising, they're really just burning all the muscle that they're trying to gain when they're exercising.
Right. So we talked about physical stressors that can drive inflammation. We talked about emotional stressors that can drive inflammation. We talked about chemical stressors that can drive inflammation. And then there's microbial stressors, right?
Absolutely.
So we've got organisms, about 100 trillion organisms in our gut, and there's organisms everywhere. And when they're in balance in this state of homeostasis, then life is good. But when there's an imbalance of those organisms, yeast infections, bacterial infections, viral infections, beyond what our body's ability to adapt, then the toxins from those infections can trigger the inflammatory response. The organisms themselves can trigger the immune or inflammatory response. And once we get that immune or inflammatory response kicked in, now the body goes into shutdown mode, right? We're going to decrease cellular metabolism. We're going to decrease thyroid transport into the tissues. We're going to reduce thyroid conversion in an effort to slow metabolism down to try and kill the threat. So those are really the big four things that drive the stress response, that drive inflammation. And really what we want to then kind of talk about now is how does that inflammation directly impact thyroid hormone function and weight? Why can't they lose weight when they have this inflammatory mechanism going on? So one of those things is that we can talk about first is definitely with how inflammation, these inflammatory chemicals, what they do to the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, and what the eventual outcome is to the thyroid hormone. You want me to take that one, or do you want to take that one?
Yeah, go ahead. That one.
So if you have this stress that induces inflammation, inflammation will suppress what's called the hypothalamus, pituitary, and you can add in thyroid there in that as well, axis. Essentially what these inflammatory chemicals do is they suppress the pituitary's production of TSH. So your TSH level will be suppressed. And if you suppress the TSH, then the thyroid gland doesn't make as much T4 and T3. And if you don't have as much T4 and T3, you can have hypothyroid symptoms because there's not enough to get into the tissues. If we start just there. If your doctor only runs a TSH because you have hypothyroid symptoms and you have an inflammatory mechanism going on, then you're going to look normal because your TSH is normal. They may not understand that the TSH could be suppressed by inflammation because most doctors don't run what, Erica? They don't run
a full panel. They're not looking at the hormones. They're not actually looking at the active hormone that's getting, to the cells.
And they don't run inflammatory markers very often.
Yeah, that's true. That either.
How often do you see somebody come in with a TSH and T4? My doctor said everything's good, and you go, what? There's no inflammatory markers here.
Yep.
You have to look at that, right? Especially if TSH comes back normal and your patient has hypothyroid symptoms, you have to see if there's inflammatory markers. So most doctors don't run them. I mean, if the most common inflammatory marker I see run, and it's rare, but it's high sensitivity CRP, right?
Yep.
And doctors will assume if that's normal, then they don't have an inflammatory issue, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of maybe 50 inflammatory chemicals the body makes, right?
Yeah. It's rare that you ever see like a homocysteine or, any of the other inflammatory markers on there. It's very rare. And even if they do run it, it's usually still in lab range, but it's higher than what it needs to be. It means that you've got inflammation. You're just not to the point where they're flagging it yet.
Right. And so there's easy markers, but I think a lot of docs, they know what the marker means kind of in a linear fashion, but they don't know how to interpret it to bigger things. So what are some of the other markers that might indicate they have an inflammatory condition? How about homocysteine, right? Yeah. You mentioned. How about hemoglobin A1C?
Oh gosh, yeah.
Right? How about uric acid? How about ferritin? How about fibrinogen? How about triglyceride elevations? You could do cytokine testing, interleukins. You can run those, but those are tests that are a bit more expensive to run, and they're not the tests that I was just mentioning are more inexpensive tests that can be found at almost every lab, right? Yep. You could run leptin levels, you could run insulin levels. There's so many tests that when somebody understands the basic chemistry, you don't have to run $1,000 cytokine panel to know that somebody's inflamed. You just have to look at some of these other markers and interpret that data to say, oh, your TSH could be low or normal because you have an inflammatory condition because we have these markers, and that's why you're still symptomatic. But most docs just aren't doing that, right? So what's the other impact that maybe these inflammatory chemicals could have in inhibiting thyroid physiology and lead to weight gain?
Well, I would say the conversion of T4 to T3 is definitely going to be impacted when you have inflammatory markers. The overall conversion is going to be less going to active hormone, and then you're going to make probably more reverse T3, which is then going to create cellular resistance at the actual gland or at the cell itself. it's going to create hypothyroid symptoms. And so when you have that increased cortisol, you're going to push more towards the reverse T3 pathway in the liver.
Yeah. So, and the interesting thing is when we talk about the conversion, right, we have those deiodinase enzymes that we've talked about. D2, it's interesting. D2 is upregulated in an inflammatory process, right? And so people would be, well, that's good because I'm getting more T4 to T3 conversion. That should be great, right? Well, in the early phase, that may be good because you're taking what's in the cell, converting it to T3, and now you've got some hormone. The problem is the inflammatory chemicals, and I know you know this, that interleukin 6, which is one of those inflammatory cytokines, is the inflammatory process will increase the conversion. It will increase D2 to increase T4 to T3 conversion, but the interleukin 6 actually inhibits the T3 from working. So while the conversion takes place, the inflammatory chemicals inhibit the T3 from actually working, which is it's a huge issue.
Yeah.
So the other piece of that is D3, which is the one that you were mentioning that converts T4 to reverse T3 or T3 to T2, both inactive forms. Now you've got D2 increasing T4 to T3, but you've got D3 converting to reverse T3, and the reverse T3 and the T3 compete, right, for those thyroid receptors. So if you have both of these things going on, interleukin or the IL-6 is inhibiting T3 from working in the first place. So you're going to get more reverse T3 binding, which means your metabolism is going to be slowed. But most docs would not see that, right?
Yeah, they're going to miss it on a lab because they're not looking in the right places, and they may not be looking at the right markers.
Right. How often do you see reverse T3 run?
Never.
And it's not, as we talked about this many times, it's not necessarily about the flat number, right?
Yeah, it isn't.
Ratios are really important. So we have to not just take the number at face value. We have to take a look at what's the ratio of these things one to the other. So you also mentioned that inflammation drives up cortisol, right? And that cortisol blocks thyroid hormone reception, right? We also know that thyroid hormone, and if you increase cortisol, what do we wind up doing? We wind up storing
belly fat and
belly fat. Yeah. So there's another mechanism. If you have that inflammatory mechanism, I think, did you mention that there's a decrease in thyroid hormone transport from the blood to the tissue?
Yep.
Yeah. And so if there's decreased thyroid hormone transport from the blood to the tissue, now you don't have thyroid hormone in the cell to stimulate metabolism, right?
Yeah.
So
it's got to get inside the cell, and that's the final destination, and there's a lot of places it can go wrong in the meantime.
So that inflammatory mechanism can really mask a cellular thyroid problem, because the thyroid gland is being suppressed, right? TSH is being suppressed by the inflammation. You won't necessarily see that T4 and T3 are actually not being made sufficiently because it's not getting into the tissue. So it just hangs out in the blood. And so if that's all the doctor is looking at, maybe a progressive doctor is doing TSH, T4, T3, free T4, free T3. Maybe they're running all of those and saying, look, your TSH is normal, maybe even low. Your thyroid, your serum values are normal, right? Your blood values of thyroid hormone are normal. You don't have a thyroid problem. Yet they haven't done reverse T3, and they haven't looked at those ratios, and they haven't looked at the fact that the patient's got an inflammatory condition. So this is a patient who will struggle. The metabolism is going to be slowed. They're going to gain weight, right? So what other mechanisms can we talk about that cause somebody who's got a thyroid problem to have a really tough time losing weight?
I mean, we've covered a lot of the stressors. Let's see, we did chemical, emotional, physical. I think that's a lot of them. That's the big picture of most of them. Is there one that we're missing?
Yeah, you know what? I think it's really important because I think it comes down to it does come down to eating and food. When people are stressed, what do they have a tendency to do? Is they have a tendency to eat, right?
Yep.
And so if you're eating out of a state of depression, we need to talk about why they might get depressed when they're sick and ill, right? And then if they're eating in an effort to kind of boost their neurotransmitters and maybe feel a little bit better, now they're choosing probably bad choices of food, lower activity, lower metabolism. So those extra calories, that extra glucose is going to go right into fat storage. It's not going into the tissue, right? But why did they get depressed in the first place? Part of that inflammatory mechanism, right, changes what happens with something called tryptophan, right? We talked about this on a podcast.
Yeah, we have a whole podcast on the depression and why people get depression with the hypothyroidism. And so, yeah, it comes down that there's something broken in another pathway that's indirectly affecting thyroid physiology. Right.
So if somebody's got this inflammatory condition, they're going to increase neurotoxins with their tryptophan. Their tryptophan is going to be converted to neurotoxins, which is going to make them tired, fatigued, angry, irritable, right? And then it's going to decrease the production of serotonin, which is going to leave them sad and depressed. Well, what do most people do when they're sad and depressed?
They want to eat.
They eat. That makes them feel better. That's totally understandable. But the depression, as we talked about on the other podcast, is a normal consequence of sickness. It is healthy illness behavior. And so that's going to create some issues. If serotonin is not being made as at the same levels, or it's being more quickly metabolized by the inflammatory chemicals, then there's also something that's not being made well, and that's called melatonin, right? And melatonin helps you regulate your circadian rhythm. Melatonin plays a big role in sleep, and if you don't sleep, that creates chronic stress too, right?
And depression.
And so what happens if somebody has chronic stress response especially at night, right? There's been plenty of research that shows that they're going to gain weight. What's definitely some of the impact of that is on you're constantly and chronically, if you don't sleep well and you have disrupted sleep, you're triggering more and more inflammatory chemicals, increasing your catecholamines, increasing your cortisol, increasing belly fat. And the other thing we do is we decrease vagal function, right? So our vagus, which runs our digestive system, right, starts breaking down. So we don't break down, digest, absorb the nutrients, which leads to more problems with detoxification. So there's so many ways and reasons that somebody who is hypothyroid is going to just struggle to lose weight. And I don't think that their primary goal, and for anybody who's listening, we both get it, right? You want to lose weight. We understand that. But a healthy body burns fat. A sick body stores fat. And so if you're struggling to lose weight, your body's sick. Most doctors will tell you that you're sick because you're overweight. I think you and I would both argue that in 80 to 90% of the cases, the reason they're overweight was because they were sick first, right?
Most of the time you're sick in the first place and your body's just putting on weight as a symptom. Weight gain is just another sign that that there's something broken at a chemical level.
Right. And so when people when their primary goal is to lose weight, right? How would you explain to somebody that, hey, the first thing we got to do is get you healthy, and then we should start to see that weight loss?
It's definitely, you have to make them realize what we just said is that there's a reason why you're putting on weight, and if we don't fix all the other stuff, you're just putting a Band-Aid on it. You can try all the fad diets, and you may be able to lose a little bit of weight here and there, but you're going to put the weight back on unless you fix what's broken. The underlying mechanism has to be fixed. And so going back down to the foundational stuff, you want that stuff will come, but we've got to get you there. So we don't want to put a Band-Aid on it. We want to fix it, find out what's wrong, what's creating the inflammatory response. And then ultimately the weight's going to come off on its own without you having to put in. People think of weight loss as that it's too much work to lose weight. Well, it shouldn't have to be if your body's working optimally.
Yeah, because it's not about calories, right?
No.
It's not just calories. Yeah, if you sit and do nothing and you consume tons and tons of excessive calories, the chances are you're going to put some weight on in time.
Mm-hmm.
But there's always the skinny person that eats more food than the heavy person, and the person who's heavy who doesn't eat much at all, and that the heavy person can't lose weight and they're barely eating. So it's not about calorie load. Somebody tried to prove that to me the other day, that if I eat less calories, I'll lose weight. I said, right, you could lose, if you eat, let's say you eat 500 calories less per day for the next 2 years, then you should whittle away to nothing. You will not even exist in 2 years if that's the way it was. Mm-hmm. She's like, well, no, I'll hit a set point. Right, you will hit a set point. So it's not about calories. Mm-hmm. It's about how our body processes and deals with the calories that we put in and the inflammatory processes and everything else that goes on.
And that's another source of stress, is that if you see your friends or your husband or, somebody else eating the same amount of food, but yet they're losing weight and you're gaining weight, there becomes a frustration and more stressors that's added on. So you have to understand that it's not just calorie in, calorie out. There's a lot of other things that play into it that have to be, looked at. There's a lot of chemical processes that may be different in your body versus what's going on in their body.
Yeah, and it's hard to compare guys to gals, right? Yeah. The chemistry is really quite a bit different. So when a husband and wife are trying to do the same things, it's really common for the spouse to get really irritated with the man because they look at food, and the female looks at food and she gains weight, and the spouse can eat as much as he wants, or they're both overweight. He starts exercising and he's lost 20 pounds and I've only lost 2. There's so much more complexity to physiology and healthy weight loss than just eat less, exercise more. That just doesn't work, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And women are just, their physiology is just prone to holding on to more fat. I mean, it's just part of the physiology that females are going to hold on to it more. So what are some tips that we can leave the viewers, the listeners with today? What do you think?
I mean, I think going back to, you've got to deal with your emotional stressors, reevaluate your life. Think about some of the major things, even if it was in your childhood that you think you've gotten over, maybe go back and, think about how that may be affecting your life now, the things you may be holding on to, grudges that you may still have, looking at emotional stuff. Food is going to be huge, Most people listening to this, if you're listening to this, you already have an idea of what, a healthier diet is. Maybe you're eating paleo, maybe ketogenic, you're gluten-free, dairy-free. Those are the first starts. So if you're not there, that's where you definitely need to get to, reducing your sugar intake, reducing your carbs intake, focusing more on whole foods and reducing processed foods. It's that overall chemical load. So making sure that you're eating organic foods. And just, reevaluating the stressors in your lives, all of them, going back to all that.
Even habits. I mean, I try and get people to say, tell me what you do for the day. Tell me what you do from start to finish, and let's look at some of the habits. And when you start to look at the habits, you start to see, okay, here's part of a problem, here's a problem, here's a problem. And if you make some small changes to some of the habits you have, replace some of the ones that you do that maybe aren't as healthy as they should be with some of some things that are maybe more beneficial for you, that's easy. But what happens is you do these things day in, day out. You don't realize that they're good or bad for you. You just do them. It's part of your process. You're up till 11:30 at night, check in Facebook and Instagram and those things, right? And so you don't realize that just light blasting into your eyes before bed just totally dysregulates your sleep and wake cycles. And now that's having an impact on your quality of sleep through the night, which is driving inflammation, which is driving you to gain weight, right? Which is thyroid physiology. Just little things sometimes are all the things that need to be, or just things that need to be addressed lifestyle-wise that really, if you can take a look back at, okay, what are my physical stressors? What are my emotional stressors? What are my microbial? Is it possible I have microbial stressors? That's where you work with definitely a functional medicine practitioner. What are the chemistry things I can change? Do those things and do that self-evaluation, because they don't cost anything to sit down and really do it. But very few of us really sit back and take a look at what we're doing in our life and our habits and what we really eat and drink through the day. But I think if more people did that, they would probably be a ton healthier. Yeah. We talked about this on other podcasts, really taking a look at breathing, how you breathe during the day. It has a huge impact on how you breathe at night and the quality of sleep, and things like just learning how to breathe better, learning how to sleep with your mouth closed, breathing through your nose. Those things can be huge in helping you lose weight and reduce the stress and the inflammatory cascade on your body. So I think it really goes back to, just as Dr. Erica said, a lot of foundational things. Is there supplements people could take to improve things? Absolutely, there's things that you can take. But I know I'm tired of looking at people's supplement list. I started 2 new patients this week. One was taking 25 supplements. The other one was taking 32 supplements. And it's not a supplement thing. My job, and I'm sure you do the same thing in the beginning, is to take these people and reduce their supplement load. Let's get back to basics. Even though we sell supplements as part of what we do, that's not the goal. The goal is not to have you be the world record holder of supplement taking. It is to be healthy, right?
Yeah. You can't supplement yourself out of a poor diet, poor emotional habits, poor physical health. I mean, you can't supplement out of that. You have to evaluate and change your life and your lifestyle. Then you add the supplements to be able to, bridge the gap between the two as you're starting to make those changes.
And we talked about mouth taping on one of the previous episodes, and I said to a patient the other day, there's not enough supplements I can give you to suppress you to sleep that will override you breathing through your mouth and creating hypoxia or oxygen debt all night. I can't. There's no way. So the cheapest way to do this, and the way that's going to be the most efficient for you, is just to learn how to breathe again. I don't want to do that. It's boring. I'm like, yeah, but that is the most effective way to do it. Yep. And as she starts to work on that, she'll reduce her inflammatory load. She'll reduce the stress. Her thyroid physiology will work better. She'll be able to lose weight just doing that. So it's so important that we do those basic life things. So we got to wrap this up because we're pushing an hour on today's, and that's about the length of time we want to max out, maybe longer some other day. So let's finish. We talked about what caused it. We talked about some things to work on, definitely lifestyle factors. If you've addressed all those lifestyle factors and you're still struggling, then you definitely need to seek out a functional medicine practitioner like Dr. Eric or myself, who specializes in thyroid physiology. And you can find Dr. Erica at
Brain and Body Health Center on Facebook. You can find us at brainandbodyhealthcenter.com, and then the Doctors Riggleman on Instagram.
And you can find me at chronicconditionrecoverycenter.com, thyroidproblemsdoctor.com, and sometime in very near future, I will be on Instagram. I'm on Instagram. I'll start posting things on Instagram. And you can find my Thyroid Thursday videos on my website, thyroidproblemsdoctor.com. You can find the podcasts available there as well. We also have I think you can find them on YouTube and iTunes. And one of the things that's really important to us, we're in a very short period of time, we're really gaining a lot of traction, getting a lot of people to download the iTunes link. But what would really help is to get some feedback back about what you like about the podcast, what questions you need answered, what problems you're having, because we really want to make sure that we are answering your questions. So if you can give us some feedback, whether you reach out to Dr. Erica or myself, or you put some commentary wherever you're watching the video or listening to the MP3 or the iTunes, please give us some feedback. And if you'd be so kind, let your friends, your family know about the podcast so we can grow this podcast. We've got some great guests coming up in the near future, and we definitely want to get our message out there to those that are struggling and suffering with thyroid problems and are being told that there's nothing wrong with them. They're just crazy, lazy, they eat too much, or they're just nuts. Okay? So we're going to wrap this one up. Dr. Erica, as usual, thank you so much for doing this podcast with me. I totally appreciate it.
Yeah, it was definitely good. Got some good information today.
Yeah, and I know the listeners appreciate it as well. So Thank you. And we will sign out for today. All right.
Yeah.
Take care, Dr.
Yeah, you too.